In the remote mountains of the Rockies, where the winds howl and the snow never stops, a man sets out to challenge everything he's known about survival. When the neighbors laughed at his unconventional construction, they had no idea what was coming. His Quonset hut inside ancient ruins would change the way people thought about shelter and survival itself. Before we dive into this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. And if you enjoy tales of innovation and survival against the odds, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is even more unbelievable than this one. The morning was bitterly cold, the kind of cold that seemed to seep into your bones no matter how many layers you wore. The wind swept across the valley, howling as it whipped the snow into a frenzy. In the distance, standing stark against the barren landscape, were the remnants of ancient stone columns. They towered above the land, a forgotten monument to a time long past, their purpose now a mystery. And there, nestled among the ruins, stood a structure that didn't belong. An incongruous Quonset hut, half metal and half rust, sitting like a beacon of defiance amidst the relics of a bygone era. James Reed stood outside the entrance, his breath misting in the frigid air. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man, dressed in layers of heavy wool, leather, and fur. His beard, thick and dark, was matted with snow, and his wide-brimmed hat was pulled low against the wind. Despite the harsh weather, he seemed at ease, his boots crunching in the snow as he walked along the perimeter of the Quonset hut, inspecting the structure with the care of someone who had built it with his own hands. The neighbors had laughed when he first set up the curved metal frame inside the ruins. They'd called it a foolish idea, an eyesore, a testament to his stubbornness. But James didn't mind. He'd heard it all before, and in the end, their ridicule would only fuel his determination. As he approached the door, his mind flashed back to the moment when he'd first discovered the ancient site. He had been out hunting in the mountains, trying to find shelter for the harsh winter, when the ruins caught his attention. It wasn't just the stone columns that intrigued him. It was the sense of history, the quiet mystery that seemed to hang in the air. Here, among these ancient stones, he felt a connection to something older, something larger than himself. But as he examined the site, he realized that the stone ruins alone wouldn't provide the shelter he needed. The freezing temperatures of the Rockies could be unforgiving, and James wasn't a man to take unnecessary risks. So, he made a decision that would raise eyebrows in the small mountain community, a decision that, over time, would prove to be as revolutionary as it was practical. James would build his shelter inside the ruins, not a cabin, not a tent, but a Quonset hut, designed to withstand the harshest elements, a hybrid of modern ingenuity and ancient strength. It was a structure that would stay warm in temperatures others would have thought impossible to endure. And so he began. The decision to build inside the ruins had not come easily. The idea had seemed absurd to many, including James himself at first. A Quonset hut wasn't exactly a traditional shelter for a man living in the wilderness, but he had always been a problem solver. He had built his life on the foundation of finding solutions where others saw obstacles. The cold was his obstacle now, and the Quonset hut was his answer. The first step was securing the materials. James knew he would need a mix of both modern supplies and what he could find locally. The metal sheeting for the Quonset came from a nearby town, and the wood he gathered from the forest. He had been warned about the effort required, but he was determined. Every day he would walk back and forth between the forest and the ruins, hauling logs, nails, and pieces of metal, the weight of each load growing heavier with the passing days. He worked alone, as he always did. The locals offered to help, but James preferred to do things his way, one mistake at a time, if need be. His hands, calloused and rough from years of hard work, moved steadily and with purpose. He started by laying a strong foundation. The stone ruins provided a solid base, but James knew that wasn't enough. He had to reinforce the ground before he could proceed with the structure. He dug trenches around the perimeter of the stone columns, using the rocks he found to stabilize the area. Every evening, after a full day of work, he would sit by the fire and reflect on the progress. The nights were long, and the cold crept in, but James never let it stop him. As the structure began to take shape, James's optimism grew. The first few weeks had been the hardest. The foundation had taken longer than he expected, and the weather had not been kind. But as he bent over the framework, securing the metal to the stone, something inside him felt sure. The Quonset would work. It had to. By the end of the first month, the basic shape of the hut was visible. The long, curved roof was starting to take form, and the doorframe was already in place. James stood back and surveyed his work, his breath steady in the crisp mountain air. He could already feel the warmth starting to build inside the metal shell, an early sign that his project was beginning to come together. The neighbors were still skeptical, still laughing behind his back, but James knew the truth. The Quonset hut would be the key to surviving the relentless winters that lay ahead. It was a gamble, yes, but one that he was willing to take. As the snow began to fall once more, James made his way to the nearby town to purchase the final pieces of the structure: insulation, a stove, and heavy canvas to cover the windows. The Quonset hut was about to become more than just an experiment. It would be home, as winter's grip tightened around the mountains. James Reed found himself facing a new set of obstacles, ones that no amount of metal, wood, or stone could easily fix. The cold seemed to cut deeper with each passing day, and with it came the loneliness that often accompanied life in the wilderness. The Quonset hut, once just a strange idea, had now become a sanctuary, but it was still far from complete. The structure's promise of warmth, a glimmer of hope against the harsh conditions, was slowly becoming a reality. James spent the following weeks working tirelessly on the interior. The insulation he had ordered arrived, but it wasn't enough to stave off the bitter cold of the Rockies' winters. His idea had been sound, modern materials meeting ancient stone, but he realized, too late, that the harsh temperatures required more than just the shell of a structure. He needed to rethink his approach. In the quiet of the morning, he examined the hut's walls, rubbing his hands across the metal. The coldness of the metal was sharp to the touch, and though he had covered much of the surface with insulation, the real test lay in how it would perform against the temperatures that were yet to come. The stone columns around him, relics of another time, seemed to mock his efforts. Their steady, silent presence, unfazed by the ever-changing seasons, reminded him that time itself had no interest in his survival struggles. He spent the next few days working on the ventilation, understanding that without proper airflow, the interior would quickly become suffocating. The last thing he needed was to suffocate inside the very structure that was meant to protect him. He installed small, adjustable vents along the walls, hoping to keep the air fresh and prevent the cabin from becoming too stifling. The work was tedious, but it was the only way forward. James didn't see many people in the mountains anymore. The small town nearby had become a ghost town of sorts, its once bustling community scattered and disbanded, most leaving for more hospitable places. Those who remained had little interest in his unconventional cabin. They had all but forgotten about him, dismissing his efforts as impractical or downright foolish. But James understood something that they did not. This cabin was more than just a shelter. It was his answer to a problem no one had fully understood. It was the physical manifestation of his resolve, and as he worked, it became clearer that his solution, however strange, might be the key to surviving this wilderness. As the days grew shorter and the snow continued to pile up, James stood back one afternoon to survey his work. The Quonset hut now stood as a testament to his stubbornness, his dedication to surviving where others had failed. The structure might not be perfect, but it would have to do. With each plank of wood, each nail hammered in, James could feel the cold slowly retreating. The inside of the hut, though still raw and unpolished, began to feel like home. But just as he began to believe that the worst was over, the weather turned again. This time, it wasn't just snow. It was the beginning of a storm that would test his resolve like nothing before. By early December, the mountain had begun to show its true face. The storm came out of nowhere, as if the skies had simply decided to give up and unleash their fury. Snow whipped through the air, thick and fast, burying the ground beneath layers of white. The wind howled, a relentless force that seemed to have no mercy, no respite. The once peaceful mountain had become a war zone, where nature itself seemed to conspire against anyone foolish enough to stay. James had prepared as best as he could. The Quonset hut, despite its strange and unconventional design, had proven to be resilient. Inside, the warmth was more than bearable, and the structure had held up well against the blustery winds outside. But this storm was different. This was no ordinary winter gust, the kind of storm that could bury even the most prepared men, leaving them trapped in isolation. As James sat by the fire, the crackling of the wood the only sound, he thought about the last few months. It had been a constant battle, one against nature, yes, but also one against the doubts that had crept in. The doubts that maybe he was wrong, that maybe he'd gone too far in his search for a solution. But as the storm raged outside, something inside him hardened. He wasn't going anywhere. This hut, this strange structure that everyone had mocked, was going to be his salvation. He had built it for moments like this. The wind howled louder now, shaking the metal walls of the hut. The snow had piled so high outside that the door was almost completely obscured. Through the small window, James could see nothing but a blur of white. The storm was everywhere, on top of him, around him, and beneath him. The mountain was alive, fighting back against the man who had dared to challenge it. In the quiet moments between gusts, James could hear the faint creaking of the Quonset hut's frame. He had designed it with durability in mind, but no one could truly predict the power of a storm like this. His heart raced as he checked the door and the window shutters, ensuring they were securely fastened. The last thing he needed was for the storm to force its way inside. The fire flickered in the corner, its warmth offering only a slight reprieve from the chaos outside. James felt the weight of the situation settle upon him. The storm would not pass quickly. It might not pass at all. And so he sat, staring into the flames, his mind racing with the realization that survival here, inside these ancient ruins, was not just a matter of building a strange cabin. It was about holding on, staying steadfast, and facing the wild, unrelenting world outside. The storm raged on for days, a relentless force that seemed to erase everything in its path. By the third day, James had completely lost track of time. The only markers of passage were the shifting patterns of snow against the Quonset hut's walls, the way the wind howled louder with each passing hour. The once serene landscape outside had transformed into an inhospitable wilderness, a place where nothing could survive the forces of nature unchecked. James had thought that the worst of the weather would come and go quickly, as most storms did. But this one held its ground, as if the mountain had decided that James's attempt to build a life here would not be so easily accepted. The winds grew more powerful by the hour, shaking the structure and causing the snow to pile up even higher, blocking any attempts at opening the door or the small window. It was as if the mountain itself was trying to swallow the hut whole. Inside, James fought to stay calm. The fire still burned in the corner, though it seemed barely enough to stave off the chill. He had stocked up on wood earlier, but with each passing day he watched his supplies dwindle. He had food, enough to last for weeks, but the isolation was beginning to weigh on him. There were no sounds of other humans out here, no one to talk to, no voices of reassurance or shared effort. This was the ultimate test of his resolve. As the storm continued to batter the hut, James worked steadily, though each movement felt like a chore. He ensured the insulation inside the walls remained secure, checking the vents and the stove to make sure the warmth inside was consistent. There was no time to rest, no time to pause for anything but survival. The storm was not just a physical test, it was a mental one. James felt the weight of solitude bearing down on him, pressing in from every corner of the Quonset hut. The snow had filled the air, and everything beyond the walls had disappeared. The ancient columns outside, which had once seemed so sturdy and eternal, were now nothing more than ghostly figures through the frosted windows, silhouettes in the whiteness. On the fifth day of the storm, James noticed something unsettling. The roof began to creak under the weight of the snow accumulating on top. He had known it would come to this, but still, the sound was enough to make his heart skip a beat. He had designed the roof to withstand heavy snow loads, but he couldn't be sure how much more it could endure. The weather had pushed the structure to its limits, and James was faced with the very real possibility that even his carefully planned design might not be enough. At that moment it hit him. The mountain wasn't just testing his cabin, it was testing him. Every decision he had made, every hour spent building, every moment spent in solitude, it had all led to this. The storm was a test of his endurance, his determination, and his ability to endure hardship alone. It was a test that, if failed, would leave him stranded, isolated, and exposed to the full wrath of the wilderness. But James wasn't ready to admit defeat. Not yet. He gritted his teeth, tightening his coat around him. The storm would pass, and when it did, he would have his answer. But until then, he would hold on, keep working, and keep fighting the cold and the solitude. He had come too far to let this mountain defeat him. By the seventh day of the storm, the worst of the weather had finally begun to ease. The wind still howled, but it had softened, its fury finally spent. James had spent most of the last few days locked inside, alone with his thoughts and the sounds of the storm. His cabin, battered but unbroken, had weathered the worst of it. The roof had held up, the insulation had kept the cold at bay, and the Quonset hut had stood its ground. For the first time since the storm had begun, James allowed himself to relax. But even as he sat by the fire, allowing the warmth to seep into his bones, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The mountain had challenged him in a way he had not expected, and it had come dangerously close to winning. He could feel the weight of the storm still hanging in the air, as if the wilderness itself was watching, waiting for him to slip up. The days following the storm were filled with quiet reflection. James spent more time outside, cleaning up the snow around the hut and checking the structural integrity of his shelter. The snow was packed so deep around the Quonset hut that it was nearly impossible to see where the ground ended and the structure began. The ancient ruins surrounding him stood tall and silent, their weathered columns like sentinels, guarding the landscape from whatever else the wilderness might throw at him. James had learned something valuable during the storm. The Quonset hut, despite its unconventional design, had proven to be more resilient than he had initially believed. It was not just a shelter, but a symbol of his perseverance, his ability to adapt and innovate. He had faced the storm head-on, never wavering in his commitment to survival. Yet, as he sat on a small rock outside the hut, staring at the ruins in the distance, he realized something else. The storm had not just tested his cabin, it had tested his spirit. The mountain had forced him to confront his own limitations, his fears and his doubts. The isolation that had once felt like a challenge had become a reality. And in facing that reality, James had come to a profound realization. Survival was not just about building the right structure or mastering the land. It was about finding the strength to keep going, no matter the odds. The storm had passed, but in its wake, James had found a new understanding of what it meant to survive. Not just physically, but mentally and emotionally. And for the first time in a long while, he believed that maybe, just maybe, he could make it. The mountain had not broken him. It had only made him stronger. James stood in the doorway of the Quonset hut, looking out over the now quiet landscape. The storm had passed, leaving the world blanketed in a thick layer of snow, its pristine surface undisturbed. The sun, weak and cold, hung low in the sky, casting a muted light over the frozen ground. For the first time in over a week, James felt a sense of calm settle over him. The battle with the storm had ended, and though he was physically drained, his spirit had been tempered by the experience. He had learned valuable lessons from the storm. His Quonset hut had held up better than he had dared to hope. The insulation, though imperfect, had been enough to keep the interior livable. The roof, despite the heavy snow, had withstood the weight. Even the small vents he had installed for airflow had proven to be crucial in keeping the air inside fresh and breathable. The hut had done its job. It had kept him warm, dry, and safe. Yet as James looked out over the snow-covered expanse, something stirred inside him. The storm had passed, yes, but there was more to be done. He couldn't afford to grow complacent. The wilderness was always testing him, and just because he had survived one challenge didn't mean the next wouldn't be harder. He began to prepare for the next phase of his life in the mountains. The storm had left him with a newfound sense of respect for the power of nature, but it had also fueled his determination. If he could survive that storm, he could survive anything. He needed to solidify his place here, to make sure that the Quonset hut wasn't just a temporary refuge, but a permanent home. James spent the next few days working on the exterior of the hut, clearing away the deep snow that had built up around it. He needed to ensure that the entrance was accessible, that the hut remained visible in case another storm came through. But there was also something else he had been thinking about, the ruins that surrounded him. The ancient columns, still standing tall despite centuries of wear, seemed to watch over him. They were a silent reminder of a time long past, a time when survival had meant something entirely different. The civilization that had once inhabited these ruins had long since vanished, leaving only their bones behind. But James felt a strange connection to them, as if the ruins held some kind of secret knowledge, a wisdom that might help him navigate his own struggles. He decided to spend the next few days exploring the ruins, looking for any clues that might give him insight into how people had lived in this harsh landscape centuries ago. Perhaps there was something in the old stonework, some hidden method of survival that he could adapt to his own needs. The idea that the past might hold the key to his future intrigued him. It was an idea he couldn't shake. As James wandered through the columns, he marveled at their craftsmanship. Despite their age, the stones were still solid, their edges sharp and well-defined. They were a testament to the builder's skill and foresight. Yet the more he looked, the more he began to see the ways in which the ruins had been altered by time and the elements. The once impressive structures were now crumbling, their foundations eroded by centuries of harsh winters and relentless storms. Still, they stood silent witnesses to a history that was slowly being forgotten. James knew that survival was about more than just weathering storms. It was about learning from the past, adapting, and finding strength in unexpected places. The ruins, with their quiet endurance, had taught him something important. They had survived because they had been built to last, and in the same way, he would have to build his life here to endure. The storm had not been his final test. It had been the first of many, and James was ready for whatever the wilderness had to throw at him next. Over the next several weeks, James found himself returning to the ruins almost daily. He had become obsessed with them, drawn by the mystery they held, and the possibility that they might offer more than just a historical curiosity. The more he explored, the more he uncovered, small carvings in the stone, hidden chambers, and remnants of tools that had once been used by the people who had lived there. It was as if the ruins were telling him a story of survival and resilience that mirrored his own. But it wasn't just the ruins that occupied James's thoughts. As the days passed, he began to notice signs of life in the area. It started with a few tracks in the snow, footprints of someone else, someone who had passed by his hut. At first he had thought it was just an animal, but then he saw more. A few days later, a man appeared at his door. The man was young, dressed in a mixture of furs and wool, his face weathered by the elements. He looked worn, tired, as though he had been traveling for some time. His name was Elias, and he had been passing through the mountains when he had stumbled upon James's hut. At first, James was cautious. He had always been a solitary man, preferring the company of his own thoughts to the chatter of others. But Elias was different. He wasn't looking for trouble, he was just looking for shelter. The storm had driven him off course, and he had been struggling to survive in the mountains on his own. James took him in without hesitation, offering food and warmth. In return, Elias offered something unexpected: company. As the days passed, the two men grew comfortable in each other's presence. Elias was a trapper by trade like James, and they spent hours talking about the land, the animals, and the way of life that had brought them both to this remote corner of the world. They shared stories, strategies, and even a few laughs, something James hadn't realized he had been missing. Soon the small community that James had built around himself began to grow. Elias wasn't the only one who came seeking shelter. Other travelers, lost or stranded in the storm, found their way to James's Quonset hut. It was strange at first, having so many people around. James wasn't used to the noise, the constant movement. But as the weeks went on, he found himself enjoying the companionship. The sense of isolation that had once defined his existence was slowly replaced by the warmth of shared experience. Together they rebuilt what had been lost in the storm, both the physical damage to the hut and the emotional toll the storm had taken on James. Slowly but surely the group of strangers turned into something more: a community. James had never expected to find such a thing in the middle of the wilderness, but as he looked around at the people who had gathered in his shelter, he realized that survival wasn't just about physical endurance. It was about connection. The mountain, with all its harshness, had forced him to find strength in numbers, to understand that even in the coldest, most isolated corners of the world, there was room for others. The ruins, too, had a message for him. It wasn't just about surviving, it was about leaving something behind, something that would endure long after he was gone. In the same way that the ancient builders had left their mark on the land, James had begun to leave his own. And he wasn't alone anymore. The days had begun to grow longer, and the sun, though still weak and cold, offered a welcome respite from the harsh, unrelenting cold of the winter months. James had grown used to the presence of others in his small Quonset hut. The steady rhythm of the fire crackling in the corner and the quiet hum of daily life had become a routine. Elias and the other travelers had settled into a comfortable rhythm, helping with the upkeep of the hut and the surrounding area. The community that had formed around him was small, but it was strong, bound together by necessity and mutual respect. But one day, as James stepped out into the clearing to collect firewood, he noticed something unusual. A figure was moving toward the hut, emerging from the forest at the edge of the valley. The figure was tall, hooded, and wrapped in heavy furs. And the movement was deliberate and cautious. James's instincts kicked in immediately. He knew this was no ordinary traveler. There was a presence to the figure, something unsettling, something that made James's senses go on high alert. As the figure came closer, James stepped forward, his boots crunching against the snow. His mind raced. Another traveler, or someone looking for trouble? The mountain had a way of bringing both kinds, and James was more than prepared for either. He kept his hand close to the axe he had slung over his shoulder, just in case. The figure stopped a few yards away from James, and for a moment there was an eerie silence between them. The stranger didn't speak right away. Instead, they seemed to study him, as though measuring his worth, their eyes gleaming from beneath the shadow of their hood. The figure's breath came out in visible puffs, as if the air itself was cold enough to freeze the words they were about to say. Finally, the stranger spoke. "I've heard rumors." The voice was low, gravelly, with a hint of something ancient in its tone. "That you've built something worth seeing." James eyed the stranger warily. "Who are you?" he asked bluntly, the suspicion thick in his voice. The stranger hesitated, the cold wind tugging at their cloak. "I'm someone who's been watching," they replied cryptically. "Watching you, watching the hut. I think you've made something special here." James's mind raced. He had heard no word from anyone in the town for weeks. The only people who knew about the Quonset hut were the few travelers who had come seeking shelter, and they had kept their presence to themselves. But this figure, this stranger, was different. He didn't seem like someone who had simply wandered in by accident. This person was looking for something. James took a cautious step forward. "What do you want?" he asked again, this time his voice softer, but still laced with distrust. The figure let out a deep sigh, and the hooded head tilted slightly. "I've seen the strength of what you've built. I've seen how the storm couldn't break you, and I need something from you, something I can't do alone." Before James could respond, the figure continued, "You have a gift, something that I lack, and I'm not alone in needing it." James's heart skipped a beat. The words were cryptic, but the meaning was clear. This wasn't just a curious traveler. The stranger was here for something important, something James didn't yet understand. A chill ran through him, not from the cold, but from the uncertainty that now hovered between them. "I can't help you if I don't know what it is you're asking for," James replied, his mind racing. Whatever this was, it was serious. The figure took a long, deliberate pause, and then, as if deciding whether to trust James, they spoke once more. "I'm looking for answers," the stranger said, "and I think you might be the one who holds them." James stood still, absorbing the stranger's words. The air between them was heavy, each syllable hanging in the frigid atmosphere like an unresolved chord. The visitor had spoken with a confidence that unsettled him, but there was no mistaking the gravity in their tone. Whatever they were searching for, it was something that James had unintentionally become a part of. His first instinct was to turn the stranger away. His life had become enough of a challenge without involving anyone else, but something about the stranger's presence was different. The words "looking for answers" echoed in his mind. James couldn't quite shake the feeling that this meeting wasn't a coincidence. The stranger had mentioned rumors about the hut, about what James had built. Who would know? The town had been deserted for so long, and the other travelers were too busy with their own lives to gossip. But the stranger had been watching, waiting. That fact alone told James this person wasn't just any wanderer. They knew about his shelter. They had been tracking him. "Answers to what?" James asked, his voice low, wary. The stranger's gaze softened slightly, but the mystery in their eyes only deepened. "To the mountain," they said simply. "To the way this land works, the way it shapes those who dare live here. And you've managed to live in the ruins, to survive the storm. What you've done, how you've made this Quonset hut, has intrigued more than just the weather." James shook his head, trying to piece together what was being said. "I don't understand," he said, his brow furrowing. The figure pulled back their hood, revealing a face marked by age, yet somehow timeless, with eyes that seemed to carry the weight of many seasons. Their hair was silver, streaked with the remnants of dark color, but their presence radiated a power that belied their age. This wasn't the figure of a simple traveler or lost soul. This person had seen things, experienced things that James couldn't even begin to imagine. "We are connected," the stranger said softly, as if sharing a secret meant only for James. "The ruins, your shelter, the wilderness, they all have a purpose. I've been looking for someone who could understand how to make this place survive, how to make it live again." James's heart raced as the stranger's words began to take shape. The ruins, the land, the hut, it all felt like more than just survival. It felt like a larger puzzle, one that James had unwittingly become a part of. He looked at the stranger, feeling the weight of their eyes on him. Something had shifted. The mountain wasn't just a place of harshness and danger. It was a place of mystery, something far more profound than he had realized. James swallowed hard. "And what do you need from me?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The stranger gave a slow, knowing smile. "You've already given me more than you realize. Now I just need you to help me see the next step." James's thoughts swirled. The answers were still out of reach, but he knew one thing for certain: this wasn't the end of his journey, it was just the beginning. The stranger's presence lingered in the air like an unanswered question. James stood at the edge of the clearing, watching the figure move toward the Quonset hut, their steps deliberate, as if they had a destination beyond the physical one. The visitor's cryptic words still echoed in James's mind. "You've given me more than you realize. Now I need you to help me see the next step." James had always considered himself a practical man, someone who dealt with what was in front of him, what he could touch, what he could build, what he could survive. But now, with this stranger's arrival, the ground beneath his feet felt less certain. What next step was the stranger talking about, and why had they come to him, of all people? As he stepped inside the hut to gather his thoughts, James felt the weight of the past settling over him. He had built this shelter to protect himself from the elements, to survive in this unforgiving wilderness. But it wasn't just the physical shelter that had changed him, it was everything that had led him here. The cabin he had built, surrounded by ancient ruins, felt like a symbol of something far deeper than he had originally thought. It was a bridge between the past and the present, between survival and something else, something unknown. The stranger had mentioned the mountain, the land, the ruins. There was something about the way they spoke, as if they knew this place, as if it had its own kind of consciousness. James had been so focused on survival that he had failed to consider the history of this land. The ruins that surrounded him were ancient, older than anything James had ever encountered, yet they stood, still standing in defiance of the elements, like silent witnesses to a time long past. What if there was more to the ruins than just stone columns and broken foundations? What if they held answers to questions James hadn't even thought to ask? As he sat by the fire, the warmth from the embers casting flickering shadows on the walls, his mind began to wander. The storm had come and gone, and he had survived. But the storm had also revealed something about him, something he had long buried deep inside. The solitude, the isolation, the endless struggle against the cold, it had shaped him into who he was today. But what if there was more to it? What if the mountain, the ruins, and this stranger all held pieces of a larger puzzle that James had unknowingly become part of? The stranger's arrival was no coincidence. James was certain of that now. They had been watching him, waiting for the right moment to approach. But what did they want from him? Why had they sought him out? The questions piled up, one on top of the other, each more unsettling than the last. A sudden gust of wind rattled the hut's walls, pulling James from his thoughts. He stood up and moved toward the door, the chill of the outside air seeping through the small cracks in the frame. It was then that he heard a sound, a faint rustling, almost as if the ruins themselves were whispering to him. He stepped outside cautiously, scanning the snow-covered ground for any sign of movement. The mountains stood silent, as they always did, but something about the stillness felt different. Something had changed. James couldn't quite put his finger on it, but he felt a pull, a deep connection to the land beneath his feet. The answers he sought were somewhere in the ruins, somewhere within the land. And he was about to uncover them, whether he was ready or not. The morning broke cold, the light barely piercing the heavy clouds that hung low over the valley. James stood at the edge of the ruins, looking out across the landscape. The stranger had disappeared into the surrounding woods, leaving James with more questions than answers. But instead of feeling uncertain, James felt a sense of purpose growing inside him, a growing realization that the journey he had embarked on was far from over. Elias had left earlier that morning, his traps set and his intentions clear. He would be back in a few days. The others, too, had gone their separate ways, seeking out their own tasks in the wilderness. But James couldn't shake the feeling that something was drawing him to the ruins again. He felt it deep in his bones, a call from the land itself, as though the earth was asking him to step deeper into the unknown. He knew the stranger had been right. The ruins held something. They had been waiting for someone like him to come along, someone who understood survival and the land in equal measure, and now he was the one who had to uncover their secrets. With a deep breath, James stepped forward, his boots crunching in the fresh snow as he approached the stone columns. The air felt thicker here, the silence heavier. He ran his hand over the smooth surface of one of the columns, its ancient markings faint but still visible. There was something about the way the stones were arranged, something deliberate in their placement that he couldn't quite understand. The deeper he looked, the more he felt as though the ruins were not just random remnants of a lost civilization, but part of a greater design, a design that had been waiting for him. As he examined the stones more closely, something caught his eye, a small opening hidden in the shadows of a broken column. It was almost invisible at first, but as he stepped closer, he could make out the faint outline of a narrow passageway leading underground. His heart raced. He had never noticed it before. How long had it been there, hidden beneath the snow and the weight of centuries? Without a second thought, James knelt down and began brushing away the snow. The opening was small, but just large enough for him to fit through. He hesitated for a moment, the silence of the mountains pressing in on him. But then, with a determined breath, he crawled through the narrow passage and into the dark space below. The air inside was cool and damp, but not unbearable. The passageway twisted and turned, leading him deeper beneath the ruins. He could barely make out the walls around him, but there was a strange, ancient energy that hummed through the earth, as though the very stones were alive. After what felt like an eternity, the passage opened up into a small chamber. The walls were lined with faded carvings, symbols that James couldn't understand, but that seemed familiar all the same. In the center of the room stood an altar, its surface worn smooth by time. There was something about it, something that pulled at him, as if it held the answers he had been searching for. As James stepped forward, his hand trembling, he felt a wave of realization wash over him. This was it. The place he had been searching for, the place where the land itself seemed to be, calling him. The ruins were not just a remnant of the past, they were a gateway, a path to something greater. The path had been hidden for centuries, waiting for someone to uncover it. And now, James was that person. The journey was far from over, but for the first time, he knew that he was on the right track. The land was speaking to him, and he was finally ready to listen. The walls of the underground chamber were suffused with an eerie quiet, as if time itself had stopped. James stood frozen at the entrance, the dim light from his lantern casting long shadows across the stone-carved symbols that adorned the walls. Each carving seemed deliberate, painstakingly etched into the rock, their designs intricate and mysterious. They told a story, though James couldn't yet understand the meaning. The weight of the chamber pressed against him, and he could feel the pulse of history in the very air. He had no way of knowing how long the passage had been there, or who had created these carvings, but the significance of what lay before him was undeniable. This place had been hidden for a reason. It wasn't just a forgotten relic of a lost civilization, it was a key, and James was the one who had unlocked it. His eyes darted from one symbol to the next, searching for patterns, something that would explain why this chamber existed in the first place. The altar in the center of the room loomed large, a silent sentinel standing guard over the secrets of the past. It seemed untouched by time, its smooth surface inviting him to step closer, to understand what it was meant for. Every part of him screamed to approach, to investigate further, but he remained rooted to the spot, wary of what the chamber might reveal. With a deep breath, James moved toward the altar. The air was cool, but it wasn't the biting cold of the mountain's winter. It was the chill of something ancient, something that had been buried beneath the earth for far longer than he could comprehend. As his fingers brushed the surface of the altar, he felt a strange sensation, as if the stone itself was alive, humming with energy that he couldn't explain. He ran his hands over the carvings on the altar's edge, following the lines with his fingertips. They felt smooth, yet alive, as though they were speaking to him, urging him to understand. As he traced one symbol, a small shift in the stone caught his attention, a hidden compartment, almost imperceptible, tucked beneath the altar's surface. With trembling hands, James slid his fingers into the crevice, working to open the compartment. After a moment of pressure, the stone shifted, revealing an object, a small weathered scroll, tightly bound with a piece of leather. His heart raced as he gently removed the scroll from its hiding place. The leather was cracked from age, and the edges of the parchment were frayed, but the markings on the scroll were unmistakable. It was a map. A map of the land, but it wasn't just a map of the terrain. There were symbols and pathways, places that were not marked on any modern maps, locations that only the ancients could have known about. The symbols matched those on the walls, and as James carefully unrolled the map, his eyes widened in disbelief. It wasn't just a map, it was a guide that led to something deeper, something hidden beneath the mountains themselves. For the first time, James understood. The ruins weren't simply a place of the past, they were a doorway to something far greater. The map was a key to uncovering what had been lost to time, and it was leading him toward an ancient truth that no one had known for centuries. He wasn't just surviving in the wilderness, he was part of something larger than himself, something that had been waiting for the right person to come along and unlock its secrets. The weight of it all crashed down on him. He had stumbled upon something far beyond his comprehension, and now there was no turning back. The map had found its way into his hands, and he was the one who would follow its path. He was no longer just a man trying to survive in the mountains. He was on the cusp of discovering a legacy that would change everything. James could barely contain his excitement as he rolled up the ancient map, tucking it carefully into his pack. His mind raced with possibilities, the weight of the discovery settling over him like a cloak. He had been looking for answers, and now he had them. The ruins were no longer just a place of historical interest. They were a treasure trove of secrets hidden beneath the surface of the land. And James was the one who had been chosen to uncover them. But as he stood there in the chamber, the reality of the situation began to sink in. The map was the beginning of something much bigger than he had imagined. The journey it promised was not a simple one. The symbols on the map pointed to locations that were remote, hidden deep within the mountains, places that no one had ventured to in generations. The path would be difficult, filled with unknowns and dangers that he had never anticipated. James glanced back at the passage he had crawled through to enter the chamber, his mind already mapping out the route back to the Quonset hut. He had been so focused on the task ahead that he had forgotten to consider the risks. It wasn't just the wilderness that he had to worry about. It was the people who might seek out the secrets he was uncovering. The stranger had come for a reason, and if they had found him, others might do the same. There was no telling who would come after the truth James had uncovered. He took a moment to steady himself, running his hand over the stone walls as if to remind himself that this was real, that the ancient symbols, the secrets they contained, were now part of his world. He wasn't just a survivor anymore. He was on the brink of a discovery that would change everything, and he wasn't alone. Elias and the others back at the hut might not understand yet, but James knew he had to share this with them. They had become part of his life, and now they would become part of this journey. With the map secured, James made his way back to the surface, the chamber growing distant behind him. The weight of the mountain pressed down as he emerged into the open air. The sun was just beginning to dip behind the peaks, casting long shadows across the snow. The wind had quieted, but the chill still hung in the air. As he trudged back toward the hut, his thoughts focused on the journey ahead. There would be no turning back now. The map was a guide, but it was also a challenge, a call to action that James could not ignore. What lay ahead was uncertain, filled with unknowns and dangers, but one thing was clear. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was part of something far larger than he had ever imagined, and the true test had only just begun. James stared at the map, the firelight flickering in his eyes as Elias sat beside him, studying the cryptic symbols. The wind outside howled as the storm began to pick up, but inside the hut, a strange warmth filled the air, a feeling of anticipation. "Where does this lead?" Elias asked, his voice thick with curiosity. James ran his finger along the lines of the map, tracing paths that seemed to crisscross with no discernible pattern. The more he studied the symbols, the more certain he became that they weren't just random markings. They were instructions. They were leading him somewhere deeper into the mountains. "I think it's a trail," James muttered. "A hidden route. An old one. This isn't just a map of the land, it's a guide." Elias leaned forward, his eyes narrowed. "A guide to what?" "I don't know yet," James admitted, "but I intend to find out." He could feel the weight of the map in his hands, and it wasn't just parchment and ink. It was a call to action. It was as though the map itself knew he was the one it had chosen to carry its secrets. The symbols matched the carvings in the ruins, the same ancient patterns James had found weeks earlier. And as the wind outside began to howl louder, he knew that it was time to act. There was something more to this land, something more than survival, and the map was the key. "I think the first stop is the eastern ridge," James said, standing up. "We'll need to move quickly before the storm gets worse." Elias nodded. "Then let's go." They gathered their gear and prepared to face whatever lay ahead. The storm outside raged, but within the hut a fire burned, an omen of the journey to come. The wind bit at their faces as they trudged through the snow, the heavy packs on their backs weighing them down. The journey had been slow, the narrow pass they were following growing steeper with each step. James led the way, his eyes scanning the surroundings, his heart pounding with the realization that they were venturing into unknown territory. "The eastern ridge should be just up ahead," James called over his shoulder to Elias, who followed closely behind, his breath clouding in the cold air. Elias nodded, though his face was grim. The path had been difficult to navigate, and the snow was only getting thicker. Yet, the further they went, the more a sense of urgency grew in James. The map was guiding them, no matter how treacherous the trail. He knew that whatever waited at the end of this path was more important than anything they'd encountered so far. After what felt like hours, they came upon a narrow ledge. The mountainside dropped sharply beneath them, and James could feel the weight of the land pressing down, as though it were alive, watching them. The air was thick with the quiet of the storm, the snow swirling around them in a disorienting blur. It wasn't just the weather, they were close. James stopped, his breath sharp, as he scanned the cliffside. A faint glimmer caught his eye, a sliver of stone that stood out against the snow-covered landscape. It was a symbol, barely visible but unmistakable. The lost way was real. "This is it," he said, his voice barely audible over the howling wind. Elias joined him, his eyes wide with realization. "The ruins, the map." James nodded. "We've found it. The first clue." The journey had led them here, but the real discovery was just beyond this point. The lost way wasn't just a path, it was a gateway to something far deeper, and the mystery of the mountain had only just begun. James stared at the strange stone markings before him, his breath visible in the crisp air. The mountain's quiet was oppressive, broken only by the occasional gust of wind that carried with it the faintest scent of earth and time. Elias stood beside him, eyes narrowed, his hands trembling slightly from both the cold and the realization of where they had arrived. The symbols on the rock face were undeniable. They matched the ones from the map, from the ruins, and the cavern beneath. They were connected, woven into the very land, but now, as James pressed his fingers against the stone, a strange, subtle vibration ran through his hand. "I don't think we're supposed to just look at this," James muttered, more to himself than to Elias. Elias eyed the markings carefully. What do you mean? I mean, James trailed off, unsure. Something told him the symbols weren't just decorations, they were a key, something meant to be activated. He traced a pattern in the rock, and as he did, the ground beneath them shifted, the stone wall groaned, and a low rumble vibrated through the mountain. A hidden door, large and ancient, began to creak open in front of them. James's heart raced. It was real. The legends were true. The passage revealed itself. A narrow, dark corridor leading deep into the heart of the mountain. Cold air rushed out, but behind it was the undeniable sense of ancient knowledge waiting to be discovered. Elias glanced at James. This is it. The lost way. With a steadying breath, James stepped forward. They were about to enter a world forgotten by time. The past had opened itself to them, and they couldn't turn back now. The corridor stretched far into the darkness, the flickering light of their lantern barely illuminating the stone walls. The passage was narrow, the air thick and cool, but as James and Elias ventured deeper, the atmosphere shifted. The further they walked, the more the mountain seemed alive, as though the walls themselves were breathing. "I've never felt anything like this," Elias murmured, his voice hushed. There was an unspoken fear between them, a recognition that they were entering something ancient, something that had been untouched for centuries. The walls around them began to change as they moved forward. The crude markings they had seen outside faded into intricate carvings, symbols that were far more complex. The designs seemed to pulse with an energy that was both unsettling and mesmerizing. James's heart pounded in his chest, but there was no turning back. The passage led them to a cavern, vast and silent, the air heavy with a sense of expectation. At the center of the cavern stood an altar, illuminated by an unnatural light. The altar was surrounded by carvings, but it was what lay upon it that captured James's attention. A crystal glowing softly with an inner light. It pulsed with an energy that seemed to resonate with the very air around them. James reached out, feeling the warmth radiating from the crystal. As his fingers brushed against it, the ground trembled, the cavern shaking violently as if the mountain itself were awakening. "James, what have we found?" Elias whispered, his voice full of awe and fear. James didn't have the answer, but as the light from the crystal grew brighter, he knew one thing for certain: they had uncovered the heart of the mountain. The true legacy was about to be revealed.